closely with is Doug Maughan, who's in our S&T area in the Department of Homeland Security. And together, one of the individuals that we deal very closely with is Robert Rodriguez, the gentleman that is sitting to my right. He has been an ardent and very persuasive spokesperson all across the country to encourage research and development and to make it more attractive for U.S. money to be invested in U.S. companies to help change some of this tide. Now, I'm not saying this as, a bout of nationalism, because we're all interconnected with the internet. That's the beauty of it. It's a long logistics train. The technology may have been developed by the Western world, but it's being exploited by our adversaries. I'm going to give you a rough analogy, and it's a very rough analogy. The Romans built an infrastructure that consisted of the Appian Way, roads, and also aqueducts to bring water into their cities. As long as they protected those assets, either with their own individuals or with trusted second parties, their civilization remained. But when they let those logistic lines of communication deteriorate, it opened the pathway for the Franks, the Gauls, the Vandals, and the Hun. And these are not rock groups on a world tour. But they marched in, they exploited the technology that Rome developed to bring down Rome. We can't afford to have that happen in our lifetime. Don't think just of yourselves, but think of the legacy that you can leave your grandchildren. You want them to live in a better world than we currently live in. You can make a difference.
Okay, Robert, back to the topic on if you're advising a policymaker, what would you advise them? What would you consider an act of war or not? We heard about a couple of great options in whether it's irregular operations or special operations. What's your perspective on it?
First, I want to thank Rich for his most eloquent remarks. He's always a challenge to follow after. Thank you for your comments. Very kind of you. I want to touch on Melissa's point there, definition of war. It is very hard to define what war is when we really can't and don't understand the internet. If we truly understood the internet, we'd be able to protect it better. Recently, Admiral McConnell made some comments about what he believed was defined as war, cyber warfare. And Howard Schmidt had a different opinion. So there's opinions on what constitutes war. To me personally, it's society, it's societal impact, it's the level of disruption to our infrastructure, the economic impact, loss of life, very, very serious, obvious serious matters. And with the internet, it's non-kinetic, but then can be turned into kinetic type tragedies. So let's say that they were able to open the floodgates of a large dam and then loss of life occurs. Warfare, you always need to have deterrence, right? In the Cold War, we knew exactly where and who would launch a nuclear weapon. In cyber, we can't positively and accurately and timely identify where that attack may come from. Attribution is very, very difficult. Most of the offensive weapons, the capabilities are defined and built by the defense industrial base, but I advocate that the entrepreneurs in America that are building for defensive posture have great opportunities and potential capabilities to help our government as we move forward in warfare, which quite frankly will take place over the internet and not have to send bodies in when you can disable satellites and ships and tanks and communications, etc. And then going back to, is it John? Asymmetrical versus brute force, right? The adversaries are asymmetrical. They move at warp speed. They don't have the corporate governance, policy, privacy, budget, and sometimes egos of challenges that government does. They don't have the bureaucracy and the hierarchy, the morals, ethics, legal, etc. And they have one or two objectives. It's financial gain or intellectual property, industrial espionage. And then again, what is warfare? Net warfare versus cyber warfare. How do you define that? You know, the exploitation, damage of data that affects us, and how severe. This is going to be a very difficult challenge. At what point is it actually warfare?
Just want to add 30 seconds.
I yield 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So in past conflicts, we'll pull the carrier, an aircraft carrier off a country's coast as a form of increasing pressure. What is analogous to that in the virtual world?
So essentially gunboat policy, but in the cyber realm.
So, Mr. President, you asked me to give you policy advice on warfare on the internet. The biggest problem we face is one of analogies, and I think we're all guilty of this. Cyberspace is so new, everybody wants to describe it in something we're comfortable in, something usually related to the physical world, and that same problem can be applied to the use of the word warfare in cyberspace. We were falling back on all these analogies, you know, gunboat warfare, and I'm not throwing any darts here, but just work with me on this. Warfare in general is the last step of a series of diplomatic actions taken between countries who are trying to resolve some type of dispute, be it over land or values or beliefs or something. You try and work it out diplomatically and various things. If that doesn't work, ultimately warfare is what you get to. We can see this over thousands of years of human civilization. How does that work in cyberspace? How do we do diplomacy in cyberspace? What are the other steps that we've already taken to work out some type of dispute, some conflict between countries in cyberspace where the last action that we take, the final act, is warfare? And can we map what we know in the physical world over into the cyber world using all these different analogies that we have? And I don't think we can do that yet. We still don't understand how to do diplomacy in cyberspace. We don't know how to do bilateral talks, multilateral agreements. We don't have, a United Nations or a NATO or something of cyberspace. We don't have that common understanding yet. And to make it worse, if we want to really apply that analogy, look at the Constitution of the United States with the amendments. The Second Amendment allows each citizen the right, or provides the right, to keep and bear arms. How does that apply in cyberspace? If we start fighting, if we make cyberspace a place where we conduct war, well, what's the right of an individual citizen? Do you have a right now to fight in cyberspace? Can you keep and bear arms? Can you defend yourself as a citizen? And what are your responsibilities as the owner of private property in cyberspace? What if your private property is invaded by somebody else? Do you have the responsibility to close the doors, to put up protective measures to keep things from coming into your private property? And if you fail there, are you liable for this? Take the physical analogy of a swimming pool. You have a pool in your backyard, you fail to put a fence around it, some kid falls in, you can be held criminally liable for creating this attractive nuisance that the kid fell in. You put your computer online, you fail to patch it, you fail to do all the firewalling and all that, can you be held criminally liable for creating an attractive nuisance, something that could be used as a weapon against another country? So this analogy stuff, we have to be very, very careful. We start talking about warfare in cyberspace, we got to be ready to carry this all the way through. All the other civil liberties that we have, rights, responsibilities, things that have been laid out, all have to apply. We can't just carve out and say, oh, we'll call this warfare, but we're not going to talk about the rest of this stuff. That's the mindset the President of the United States has to have. That's the mindset we all have to have. This is very serious stuff, and it's not just pick and choose a few names and a few analogies and munge them together and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. So no, Mr. President, we're not ready yet to talk about cyber warfare. That conversation still needs to be developed.
Well, that's a very difficult act to follow because the points that Mark and Melissa and others have stated are quite evident that we are not ready. Internationally, countries can't define warfare. They'll define it differently. We can't define how to manage intellectual property, so we definitely can't figure out how to manage this thing that somebody wants to call war an attack. Is it trespassing? The other thing that we can't articulate and why we can't say it's an act of war is when you conduct that type of activity, you have an expected outcome, an expected battle damage assessment. You have expectations. You can't do that in cyber because that IP address may be sitting in domestic space could be sitting in that protected space like a hospital or other things, even overseas. So to be able to execute those activities, you got to have a level of knowledge that you can pinpoint to the exact location what you're going to do, what's going to happen, and what the impact is to that greater community. And then now you get into the political aspects and the retribution of that and what happens. So we are a long ways away from understanding that definition and then how to define the outcome and the battle damage assessment of such activities and what the political ramifications are for that. So no, we are not ready.
So my sense has always been that we should be interested in is mission assurance, not information assurance or whatever. I don't believe in our professional lifetimes we're going to get to a definition of war that all of us are going to be comfortable with. We haven't declared war since 1941 in this country in kinetic, much less in cyber. On the other hand, mission assurance basically says we have a set of objectives we want to accomplish. We need to accomplish those irrespective of the level of attack, threat, whatever we're under, whatever you call it. And to me, that's a mix of preparations and resilience taking into account velocity. So the preparations are, going back to the resilience, what have we done ahead of time to get our people ready to understand what's happening, to make our networks more resilient. And this is not going to be a 100%, all of a sudden, zero. There's going to be some degradation of capability that at some point is going to come back. So how do you prepare and make that bathtub as narrow as possible and as shallow as possible? But then there's another part of preparation that General Hayden alluded to this morning. It's the role of CNE. I mean, they're presumably, and obviously we can't talk very much about the specifics of this, presumably there are people out there on our side who know something about what's happening. And how do you bring that to bear? So, and then how do you put together a set of rules of engagement that people can respond? Because the last part of this is the time. This is not, if you have to convene the interagency committee plus the deputies committee plus the principals committee and take it to the president, forget it, you've lost. This is happening in sort of machine time in many cases. So how do we restructure our processes to take into account that reality?
So essentially what y'all just witnessed is what would happen in, say, a policy coordinating committee. You had different stakeholders and different views and vantage points dealing with a particular issue. In this case, we were evaluating cyber war. And as you see, it's a very complex problem. There's never an easy answer. There's a lot of different moving parts that come into play. And so I've only got, I believe, 5 minutes? So we only probably got time for one or two questions. So here's your chance. There's a microphone right over here to ask a question.
The question I have is, I hear a lot of talk about taking the physical aspects out of cyber warfare, and I don't quite understand that. The easiest way I can explain that, I guess, is looking over at your question on the board, and you wanted to know if anyone would be willing to confess to any federal crimes. I will.
Come see us
I've dropped road apples to government employees that had of infected USB drives and committed mail fraud. I've broken into a government agency. I've busted into, social engineered my way into most of our financial institutions. Granted, I did that legal under very specific contracts. There's a physical component to cyber warfare. Whether it's blowing up an electric grid in a particular region in the United States that are going to affect our cyberspace, whether it's physically breaking into a government agency in order to get at data or install wireless access points and try to obtain access to a government agency's network. Why do we keep trying to take the physical aspect of it out? You're correct that there are no boundaries.
Not all of us do. So, I mean, physical security does go hand in hand, certainly, with. Well,
I just remember General Hayden this morning saying, is there that transference of the physical aspects that can be applied to cyber warfare? Absolutely. I don't even know why it's a question.
So part of the issue is the analogy of taking a physical of the 4 domains that General Hayden mentioned and making those analogous to cyber versus the impact of a cyber event. The things you described are more in lines to, yes, there is